So, good evening, everyone. Today we're resuming the fall of 2020 activities of the educational and scientific project of the School of Asian Studies, which is connected to the Mediterranean area, and all things included, which is sponsored by the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs of the High School of Economics. And I'm glad to announce that the first lecture, or the first meeting that we're having this fall, is chaired by Professor Massimiliano Trentin of UNIBO. And our dear friend and colleague, and to make it short, I sort of give the floor to Massi, and we're eager to listen to your deliveries today and the revelations, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Chuprigin. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure for me to join you in this program. It's a pleasure to meet you. And again, unfortunately at a distance, but let's hope that we'll all overcome this strange, at the end of the day, quite unfortunate situation for all of us. Anyway, I just a few words about my presentation. That is, I'm going to talk about my interpretation, my reconstruction of the different processes of integration that involved Europe and the actors residing in Europe and the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean, as they were composed both by empires and later on by states. And my lecture, of course, if you have any questions during my speech, please interrupt me and ask these questions. And then if you have some more at the end of my lecture, and again, as you wish. Okay. So please follow Professor guidelines, and that's it. So let's start. The topic of this lecture is about an historical reconstruction of the relations between the different shores of the Mediterranean, in particular between European actors, political and economic actors, and political actors in the south and the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, where these north and south and east empires or states, just and try to make a journey from the 19th century up to more recent events in order to highlight some patterns of relations as they evolve, as they change along history between the different actors on the different shores of the Mediterranean. And my argument is that from the 19th century up to today, we saw different phases in the relationship between the shores, and particularly between Europe and the rest of the Mediterranean. That in some cases there were periods of integration. I mean the convergence, and with integration I mean the convergence between different actors on a common set of ideas, categories, and institutions. However, quite different from quite a common sense about what we mean with integration, in particular the positive, the consensual features around the processes of integrations. It was quite often the case that integration in the Mediterranean occurred within a framework of asymmetric power relations, or better, inequality in the distribution of power and plenty, that is, power in the sense of even the capacity to enforce your will on the others by the use of force, coercion, as well as by consent. And in many cases, this kind of these moments of integrations, so certain geographical locations or sites of wealth emerging at detriment of other geographical areas which were marginalized or set on a course of dependence and impoverishment. And this is my argument, and so that when we speak about the virtues of integration, well, we should be a bit aware about the features of such integration. Now, just some basic elements of that might be useful to know about to understand a bit of the language that I'm going to use, and the same for the value of the Mediterranean space in history. Now I try to share with you my screen. Okay. Now these are okay. I will share with you my presentations after the lecture, and I will give it to Professor Andrei, and then and I hope it might be useful for you. Now, just some concepts that I'm going to refer to, and it might be useful for you. The concept of orders and transitions, or the concept of hegemonic power, and the concept of integration. As for political order, I mean a set of ideas, categories, which translate into institutions. And those institutions are those organizations aimed at the discipline of collective social groups. And throughout history, there has been in the Mediterranean different kind of orders. And the movement from one order to the other can be labeled as transition, and it is that historical moment in which the material, social, and political conditions do gather and allow new ideas and new categories of order to transform, to become new institutions, that is, to create new orders. But of course, in history, there are very, very few revolutionary moments that signal and set a clear break from one order to the other. And usually new orders embed elements of the past, that is, of the previous orders. Sometimes the moment of transition are very long, sometimes are quicker, but there is very few moments there is a clear break from the past. And another element which is important to understand how orders have been developed and have spread, in our case of the Mediterranean, is the concept of hegemonic power. But hegemonic power, as it was formulated by Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist intellectuals, that intended hegemonic power, as the capacity and capability to impose your will over the other, using both force and consent, and not just consent as in the liberal idea of hegemony. And which means that usually hegemonic power, as was the case for imperial states or just nation states or anyway states, usually do exert at the very same time both the art of dominion, that is the threat or the actual enforcement of organized violence against rivals to subdue them, as well as consent, that is the capacity to exert the moral and intellectual leadership over allies and partners, and in order to convince them that the interest of the hegemonic power do coincide with their own interest. That's it. And usually these are two elements, two faces of the same coin. They usually in history, they have been present at the very, very same time. And here I suggest you reading the works by another Italian intellectual and scholar, Giovanni Arrighi, and the school of world system theories by, for example, and but in particular by Giovanni Arrighi, that studied much the capacity of the category of hegemonic power to let us understand historical patterns of change. But anyway, let's move now, try to see whether these concepts are suitable for even the history of the relations between Europe and Islamic or Arab or Turkish states. Now, in the Mediterranean. Now, what is the value of the Mediterranean space as for international relations? First of all, the Mediterranean is has always been a very important hub and center, kind of sliding door for global connections. That is connecting Asia with Europe and Africa, three poles of major development. And the value of the Mediterranean as a space of interaction and connection between these three different territories can be found both in the past, just looking at how the Mediterranean has always been present in the different long-distance trade routes connecting major centers of production and consumption in history. The famous Silk Roads connecting the real center of world wealth and production, which has always been Asia, connecting it to that appendix that was Europe for a very long time, passed through as much as possible through the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean, this is just to explain the role of Mediterranean in East and West connections. But the Mediterranean was also important for the connection between North and South, between the areas of sub-Saharan Africa and Europe, connecting, for example, for gold and or other important commodities, and among them, as it was even the case of slaves, connecting Africa with Europe. And the relevance of the Mediterranean was not just in the past, but as a major space of interaction, but even concerned more recent times. And for example, we move to the time of the great European colonial empires, and among them, for sure, the most important was the British Empire. And we all know that the two pillars, the two legs of Her Majesty, of the British Empire, were the British Islands and the British Raj, that is India. And the connections and the linkage between the two legs, the two pillars of the British Empire, the two sides of what economic historians label as power and plenty, passed through the Mediterranean. From Gibraltar down to to Suez, Red Sea, the Horn of Africa, and the Indian Ocean. Later on, moving to more recent time, just look at the main routes for maritime trade in the 2000s, during the 2000s, and we can see that apart from the Atlantic, apart from East Asia, the other major site of maritime trade passed through, again, the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, again. And it's not by chance, again, that the Mediterranean is so much still important for the very wealth of Europe and the very global projection of Europe towards the East and towards Asia. Again, mostly passing through the Mediterranean. Of course, there is always the possibility to circumnavigate Africa. But as a matter of fact, it is cheaper, faster, and more convenient to pass through the Mediterranean. That's a very basic point. Otherwise, the Suez Canal would have lost its sense, and still they continue to enlarge it, at least. And again, that's again for the role of the Mediterranean. Let's look at the latest great infrastructural project of relevance for the international economy. That is the famous One Belt and One Road project, conceived and financed and by China the People's Republic of China, which is made by a land route with different strengths, as well as by maritime route, still passing through the Mediterranean. Maybe still passing through the Mediterranean. This is just a few examples for what I mean with the relevance of the Mediterranean for global connections, and which is one of the reasons. And the other major reason for the Mediterranean to keep its irrelevance for the world economy and even for international and political relations is the fact that through Mediterranean there is the Mediterranean is a major transit route for energy, for the energy consumption of European industrial society. That is, of course, much of hydrocarbons consumption of Europe follow the land route connecting Russia or Central Asia to Europe. Through Central, Southern, and Southeast Europe, the Balkans, and then Central Europe. Okay, but still, the other major route is the Mediterranean and passes through the Mediterranean. That's it, connecting the Gulf, a major reservoir and production site for energy, going towards the Middle East. Going to Europe, and that was of keeping that kind of commodity flowing and passing through the Mediterranean was of utmost importance for Europe, in particular, at a crucial moment of the reconstruction of Western Europe after the ruins of World War II. And Western Europe was built up again, was reconstructed. The famous Trente Glorieuses, or the boom of post-World War II in Europe was fueled or was characterized by the transition from coal to oil, passing through the Mediterranean again. Other reason for the relevance of the Mediterranean is the fact that both in the north, in particular in Europe, it's a major site for the production of advanced weaponry. And the south and the east of the Mediterranean are sites of major consumption of advanced weaponry. And the very fact of the existence and the resilience of long-standing armed conflicts is a major reason even for keeping the flows of weaponry passing through the Mediterranean again, by air or by sea, but still passing through that area. And finally, the relevance of the Mediterranean in terms of ideas and the ideologies is the fact that within the Mediterranean or the Mediterranean area, there are the original location of the three monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Which means that what happens in terms of elaboration, even from a theoretical point of view, of these three religions in their very original centers, or what happens to the religious communities over there, located in the Mediterranean, have always had repercussions throughout the rest of the world where are located the other communities of Jews, of Christians, and Muslims. And it might seem quite paradoxical, the fact that, for example, most of the population professing these three religions actually do not live in that region where originally these religions were born. But still, what happens there have huge impact on the other on the communities spread around the rest of the world. So these are just a few elements for arguing about the relevance of the Mediterranean as a space of interaction, and even for these very reasons for the relevance of the Mediterranean were enough to motivate other powers, both within the Mediterranean and outside the Mediterranean, to try to exert a control over the Mediterranean space. A control that concerned directly those territories, or at least the control over the pace of the flows of wealth passing through the Mediterranean. Are there any questions, or shall I continue? Okay, because I cannot see now
I'm looking. I'm watching that. So
okay, but because I cannot see just now the chat, and sorry for my prehistoric capacities in handling informatics. So
okay, Massi, we're okay. Yeah. Please,
okay.
please proceed.
Okay. Now, there are some basic periods that I would like to try to share with you that saw certain kind of integration to occur. During the 19th century, in particular, we saw the rise, in particular, even in the previous century, but especially in the 19th century, we saw the rise of European imperial states, that is, states which were consolidating their social base around the concept of nation, but still had global projections through colonialism, that the more and more focused their expansion from the Americas, where they were already there, towards Asia, the more and more. They were endowed with major advanced military technology from a maritime point of view, from a naval point of view, as well as for land armed forces. And they were moving their pattern of development from economy based on agriculture, manufacturing, towards economy centered around industrial production, sustained by constant flows of financial resources. Industrial capitalism. And in their quests for expansion, for resources, for markets, the more and more directed and focused in reaching Asia. First of all, because they know that much of the wealth in history have been produced in Asia and accumulated in Asia. And but in order to reach Asia, they had to pass through territories which were organized under the rule of Islamic empires. And among them, the most important, and those that lying within the Mediterranean, was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, and there was a pattern of relationship between the European imperial states and the Ottomans that started as a penetration on the peripheries, moved then to the expansion of those areas, and finally, towards the end of the 19th century, up to I would argue the World War II, by integration. What French historian Henri Laurent argued as the creation, the construction of the Levantine Mediterranean. And the creation of the construction, of this integration meant the transformation of the Ottoman Empire and the provinces or other independent territories and institutions like Morocco, was the case of Morocco, as subaltern partners of the Europeans. Subaltern partners of the Europeans. And the Europeans moved initially by territorial conquests, and let's think of Napoleon arriving in Egypt in 1798 and just staying there for a very few years, but still, with just a very quite of a tiny military expedition, they arrived to conquer one of the main provinces of the Ottoman Empire, which was Egypt. Then, for example, the other encroachment by the Europeans on the margins of the Ottoman Empire was the conquest by the French of what we know today as Algeria, or the coastal areas on the Mediterranean of today's Algeria in 1830s, and which then continued to expand down to the southward towards the interiors. But at the same time, these territorial encroachments led, first of all, by the military capacities of the Europeans was met with even the economic penetration. Economic penetration that, first of all, concerned trade. And here, one major element was the famous or infamous, depending on the perspective, of Balta-Liman Agreement that was struck between the British and the Ottoman rulers in 1838, that where the British gave the Ottomans their military support in the repression or in the fight against the restive province of Egypt, which was expanding at the detriment of central authorities of the Ottomans, in exchange for major trade privileges that meant that British products could enter the Ottoman economic space or market by paying between 10 and 15% custom duties. In contrast, Ottoman products, except for raw materials, could enter the British market by paying a 30% custom duty on their value. So the difference between 20 and 15% marked quite of a privilege that favored the penetration of British products and British merchants within the Ottoman economy. And later on, as the British shifted their policies from mercantilism towards free trade during the 40s of the 19th century, it meant that those privileges enjoyed by the British were expanded to other European nations as well, so that all other European powers could claim for the same conditions, for the same privileges of the British in respect to the Ottomans. As a matter of fact, that produced or ingrained a mechanism according to which the Europe slowly but steadily the economies of the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean were embedded within European processes of industrial development and be transformed from quite inward-looking or self-sustaining economies, where their connections to the rest of the world occurred mainly through transit trade. Those economies in the east and the south of the Mediterranean began producing raw materials, mainly agricultural products, or raw materials for textiles, to be transformed in Europe in the final phases of the production processes, which meant that the economies of those of the south and eastern of the Mediterranean became a kind of periphery or semi-periphery, but mostly periphery, of European industrial production. And that process, for example, let's think of the agricultural production of the interior territories of today's Syria, that the more and more were connected to the Mediterranean by European-funded railroads to bring the agricultural production of the interiors of Syria, but as well as of the interiors of Anatolia towards the coastal area, to be shipped into the coastal area and then move towards the consumption, or better, for the industrial production of Europeans. And the final products then were re-exported towards the economies, the markets of the south and the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, to be consumed by, could be consumed over there. That meant that most of the profits, most of the wealth of that relationship went in Europe and remained in Europe. And as for the economy, that that period, that pattern of relations involved an exponential growth of the flows of products, money, and people across the Mediterranean. The more and more territories in the south and the eastern Mediterranean were embedded within the production processes of Europe. And that was even more the case when Europeans could exert direct control over the public finances of the same Ottoman territories. And that through quite of a familiar pattern that was the following. For the construction of major public works and infrastructures in the south and eastern Mediterranean, Ottomans and Egyptians used or borrowed money from European capitals and the European or financial institutions. However, since they couldn't pay back or couldn't service their debt in time, they had to default, and the lenders, that is the Europeans, in exchange, enter the administration of the very same finances of the Ottoman Empire, the central authority of the Ottoman empires, as well as through the finances of Egypt. And even in the case of Egypt, when the local authorities couldn't pay back or just enough or in time their debts to the European, that was one of the reasons for the Europeans, in this case even the British, to occupy the country by military means. Then, of course, there were other reasons, but one of the reasons was to take direct control over that strategic part of the world economy. And so the final point of this process of peripheralization of the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean under European control arrived in World War I, during World War I, when the central authorities of the Ottoman Empire had decided to side with Central European empires, in particular Germany and the Austro-Hungarian empires, against the British, the French, and the Tsarist Empire. From that moment on, when, despite the fact that the military balance between the forces were not that that clear till the very last moment, the Europeans decided to approach the fate of those territories as through the logics of rewards, that is, fragmented and occupying directly those portion of the former Ottoman empires, focusing on and dividing between them those territories according to their own priorities. Of course, all these processes of subalternity that the eastern and southern societies of the Mediterranean experienced was not just received peacefully, but was marked by constant efforts at resistance, or more or less active, more or less armed resistance. That's so a process that if initially the partner resistance against a subaltern integration to Europe was legitimated on indigenous, let's say, elements of allegiance, of mobilizations, like, for example, the calls of jihad against the infidels, in this case, the Europeans. Later on, in particular, from the late of the 19th centuries up to the mid of the 20th century, usually the patterns of resistance features the presence at the very same time of both indigenous elements of legitimacy for resistance, as well as elements which were original features of European politics. I mean, it really depended on who the actors and the players and the forces of resistance were speaking to. If they were speaking, for example, to population residing into the agrarian countryside of the interiors of the Mediterranean, well, they spoke the language of, for example, of Islam. But at the very same time, when the forces of resistance spoke, for example, towards or talk or negotiated towards forces, for example, inside Europe trying to forge alliances, to found audience in Europe, they spoke the words, for example, of secular modernity, of liberté, égalité et fraternité, of citizenship, saying that, okay, if we're all equals, why, at least in theory, why you Europeans do not give the same rights to us, I mean Arabs or Turks or whatever. So, and these elements of one might think about or speak of contradictions or paradox. Well, but actually they were not that contradictions at all, because it really depended on who the forces of resistance were speaking to, in order to find legitimacy, in order to find allegiance. And if the order set by the Europeans over the Mediterranean, which saw the subalternity of the Mediterranean economies to the productive industrial centers, mostly located in Europe and the more and more in northwestern Europe, so the rise of trade, the even elements of infrastructural development throughout the Mediterranean, that patterns were always instrumental to the wealth, to the, let's say, to the power and plenty of Europe. And this is why, for example, in the geography of the European-led Mediterranean, it was the coastal areas, it was the urban, in particular the urban centers located in the coast of the Mediterranean, that developed most, and where the sites, the location, where the intermediaries between Europe, the centers, and the periphery of the Mediterranean were mostly located. In particular, I mean merchants and landowners. Sorry for the editing errors in the PowerPoint, but I will give you later on with everything corrected. Those areas that were instead marginalized and suffered most from the European-led integration of the Mediterranean were the agrarian countryside, the agrarian provinces located in the interior parts of the Ottoman empires, and later on of the protectorates or mandates throughout the region. Those areas were the one that suffered most from marginalization. And more or less that period, that kind of relationship continued even after early independence, that is in particular, of course, for certain periods, certain territories like Turkey, it occurred even after their independence in 1923. But as soon as other countries, other territories got and gained their independence, and I mean in particular after World War II, the integration of the Mediterranean under European power continued, and even in the period of early independence. Because as a matter of fact, most of the leadership of the newly established post-colonial countries were from came from the families or from the elites which had major stake in the relationship with Europe, in keeping that relationship continue to work. And that was the case of the so-called liberal moments. However, because of internal dynamics both in Europe and the newly independent states in the Middle East and North Africa, that is in the eastern shores and the southern shores of the Mediterranean, that kind of integration of the Mediterranean broke apart and led to a new articulation of the relationship in the Mediterranean that developed in particular from the 60s up to the 80s. Because on the one hand, Europe had to recover, or Europe recovered from the ruins of World War II by deepening its integration within Europe through the process of the European integration as for Western Europe, and as for Eastern European countries, the integration under the Soviet Union, or integration or coordination, the more and more. So, as a matter of fact, Europe, in particular European the colonial powers like France and Britain, had to retreat from their territories, had to relinquish their power in the Mediterranean to leave space, to leave room for independent countries on the one hand, and other new non-European powers, or at least partially European powers, like it was the case of the United States of America and the Soviet Union. On the other side of the Mediterranean, new forces, called new nationalist forces, emerged, rose into power, grasped power, new forces that were nationalist, let's say, as the previous first leadership, but this time their constituencies were mostly located not really in the coastal areas, but in the agrarian provincial towns or provinces of the interiors, so that they focused, or they tried to shift most of the resources for development from the coast, which meant the Mediterranean, which meant which meant Europe, relations with Europe, towards the interior, and towards their own interiors. As a matter of fact, the free shores of the Mediterranean went on their own directions, different directions. The flows of trade diminished during in their previous features, and that led to a rearticulation, to an effort to rearticulate the relations in the Mediterranean by other means, by other priorities. And the distance experienced during the 50s of the 60s, so the Mediterranean, the countries in the south and the eastern Mediterranean, at the same time trying to translate some institutions, ideas and categories, as well as some institutions which were originally developed in Europe, back into their own countries, into their own territories, into their own societies, but for the benefit of, at least in theory, of their own population. And a major engine for these efforts was the state, the so-called developmentalist state. The state that was the engine for growth, the engine for the construction of those political communities called the nation, were these intended as the great Arab nation, or the specific nation, Egyptian nation, or of other specific states. And for the very distance that the shores, the states and the societies in the different shores of the Mediterranean were experiences at that time, so the effort by countries in the south and eastern of the Mediterranean to try to rebalance the relations in the Mediterranean through the basic categories of coordination, cooperation among sovereign states. The other side, and they began using whatever asset they had to oblige, in particular, Western European countries to rearticulate and to move away from the classical doctrines or approaches based on liberalism and free markets towards new patterns of relations that would serve the needs of the developmentalist state in the south and east of the Mediterranean. And the use of hydrocarbons and as an asset in their hands since the late 60s was a major instrument that brought European countries to elaborate new policies, new approaches that would reconstruct the relations in the Mediterranean and respect the claims for sovereignty, the calls for sovereignty by, in particular, Arab countries in the south and eastern shores of the Mediterranean. This is why the European Western countries, through their institutions of the European communities, elaborated in 1972 a set of new instruments, which were the Global Mediterranean Policy of 1972, later transformed into the cooperation agreements of the late 70s, that institutionalized the idea of the so-called embedded liberalism. That is the ultimate goal of mutual access to the markets of North and South of the Mediterranean, but at the same time letting the state and the state-led public sector play a major role by balancing the gaps or the difference in trade through the flows of aid or public finance. And this was actually an effort to reshape and rebuild the relations across the Mediterranean in new modalities that would serve, on the one hand, the interest of the Europeans, in particular the Western Europeans, which was access, the stability in the flows of energies and access to markets on the one side, and the interest of post-colonial countries in the east and south of the Mediterranean, which were entering the markets of the European communities with their own products, and given the imbalances anyway in the terms of trade, receiving flows of resources or finances into the coffins of the Arab countries of the Mediterranean, in particular, which were to serve, in theory, for major investment in productive sectors, but actually were mostly used for just consumption of European products. This led, for example, to during the 70s up to the mid of the 80s, which were the time of yes, which were the times of the huge increase in the prices of oil, the so-called oil shocks of the 70s, which led to a massive increase in the wealth of oil-producing countries, led to a major upsurge in the trade between Europe and the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean. And that occurred during or under the principles and the policies of the so-called embedded liberalism. This ended when the countries in Europe faced a major economic crisis in the late 70s and mid of the 80s, that led them to reorient their economies towards new doctrines. The former policies of state interventions had exhausted or had reached their limits, were considered no more functioning. So this let or open the opportunities for new ideas to emerge, which were the new ideas of the so-called neoliberalism. And in the Mediterranean, neoliberalism as a new set of ideas and categories for development could find the opportunity to transform into institutions from the late 80s, as a matter of fact, onwards. And there were different levers used for reshaping the relations in the Mediterranean between Europe and the other countries along the principle of neoliberalism. And one of them was the crisis of the fiscal crisis experienced by the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, in particular those countries on the shores of the Mediterranean that were not major oil producers, suffered fiscal crisis them as well, were propped up by the recycling of petrodollar, but as soon as this recycling of petrodollars ended in the mid of the 1980s, all the weaknesses, all the financial weaknesses and economic weaknesses of those countries came to the fore and had to enter a process of major readjustment of their economies that occurred under the auspices of international financial organizations or institutions, where the Europeans, as well as the United States, but the Europeans had a major role to play. And from the mid of the 1980s onwards, in particular during the 90s, all the economies of those countries had gradually, but again, steadily, to adjust to new patterns of development whose criteria were mostly set by leaders and elites of the countries in Western Europe and North America and the US. Now, it's not as it was in the past. It was not just a passive reception of the criteria, of the guidelines, of the policies set in the West. But it was a process of selection of certain elements by the elites in the Mediterranean, certain elements that were soon enforced. For example, austerity measures, cutting off investments or cutting off imports to increase savings, but without enforcing immediately major institutional reforms or major liberalizations, if not privatizations, as the West wishes. But still the trajectory was set along, and one of the major elements of those new ideas and new institutions was the promotion of development programs based on exports. But exports towards where? Towards whom? Exports towards, first of all, the big market of consumptions that was Europe again. So, however, in order to enter the market of Europe, the countries in the Mediterranean had to comply with the requirements of Europeans. And from the 90s, since the adjustment occurring in the south and the eastern Mediterranean was caused a major drop in the flows of trade across the Mediterranean because of the austerity measures, Europeans had to resort to another major initiative, the so-called Barcelona process, that coupled still the basic tenets of liberalizations and privatizations, still contain those requirements towards the Mediterranean partners, but coupled it with, let's say, with the carrots of major financial investments for infrastructure, for the adjustment and upgrading of infrastructural works, first of all located again in the coastal areas of the post-colonial countries. That was again, like it was in the late 19th century, the coastal areas were the major beneficiaries, the major targets of the initiatives led by the Europeans for the Mediterranean, for integrating the Mediterranean into the European into the European markets. And final element, however, these efforts by the Europeans bore limited fruits in the sense that those countries could never really entered in patterns of growth and development as they were hoped by the same Europeans. The only case maybe might be the case of Tunisia, partially, so that the very European countries of the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean tried to see and to look for different sources of investments, different sources for the diversification of their own economies. Even because the more and more the same leadership in those countries that for quite a long time benefited from the same privileged links with the Europeans began resenting the requests by the same Europeans, as long as these requests not only concerned economic liberalizations or privatizations, but began concerning the more and more even the political systems of those countries. So that there was a kind of combination towards finding out other alternative partners, both among the elites, for example, of the urban Mediterranean countries, as well as among even the social forces, the popular forces in the very same countries, looking for alternatives away from the Europeans, in order to free themselves from the very conditionalities, from the very requests by the set mostly by the Europeans, because they were considered no more on their interest in terms of, for the elite, for their own reproduction and survival, or for the development, their own social development, as for the popular forces of the more marginalized areas or of these countries. In particular, again, it was the case of the agrarian areas of the interior provinces in North Africa, as well as in the Middle East, or as well as in Anatolia. So it was not by chance that first, during the 2000s, among the elites, and later on with the Arab uprisings of 2000, since 2011, there was a marked shift away from, a marked effort by all those countries to reach out at new alternative partners, and which opened a lot of opportunities for new actors beyond Europe to enter the economies, the societies, as well as the politics of the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean. And these actors, these new players, were, for example, Russia, since that is, which is since the 2000s was back on track in the Mediterranean, and of course, the more and more after the Arab uprisings, but major signs were present still in the during the 2000s. It was the case of China that invested the more and more on the region and in the Mediterranean, meeting the preferences of Arab, for example, Mediterranean countries for state-to-state bilateral intergovernmental dealings, agreements between state companies, for example. But other actors that made their presence the more and more assertive in the Mediterranean were, for example, the Gulf countries. And with Gulf countries, I mean both shores of the Gulf, both Iran and the Arab monarchies, that, of course, at different levels, using different instruments, from political or military to financial, they invested into the Mediterranean, the Arab Gulf monarchies, by funding initiatives, by lending loans to the Arab countries of North Africa, as well as around the Mediterranean, by propping up certain sectors that feature high within the development of the south and east of the Mediterranean during the 2000 and 2010, which were the sectors of trade, the sector of banking and finance, the sectors of tourism, the sectors of the real estate, which were all sectors that granted or guaranteed huge margin of profits, but involved not that much job opportunities for a region that was experiences what Syrian French intellectual Samir Aita labeled as the youth tsunami of the Arab Mediterranean society in the 2000 and the 2010. That is the entry into the labor age of the children, of the sons of the baby boom of the 80s and the 90s, which were now, which entered in the labor market, but could not find much job opportunities in absolute and even in quality terms, which were corresponding to their own educational level, as well as to their own aspirations and expectations of programs and projects for life. So, and one major significant elements of the 2000s, in particular of the 2010, was that the new round of wealth, production of wealth in the region, that was sustained by the high prices of oil, that is the major commodity produced in the south and east of the Mediterranean, did not lead much back to the increase in the trade flows or in the overall exchanges between across the Mediterranean, but fueled instead and sustained instead the flows of trade or flows of exchange of people as well as finances and products within the North Africa, within the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, the flows of wealth, flows of trade and finances between Europe and the north and east of the Mediterranean continued. But it was not only, or it was not anymore, the axis, the roots of for the flows of wealth. The more and more, the flows of wealth passed or through the region, inside the region, between the Gulf and the Mediterranean, between Asia and North Africa and Eastern Mediterranean, which basically meant the diversification of the sources of wealth in the Mediterranean, no more connected exclusively or mostly to Europe. And one major element, which is quite interesting to understand, is the relevance of the rise of Eastern Asian economies for the Mediterranean. Because usually the projects like, for example, the One Belt, One Road, just promoted so much by China, were intended in Europe as another way to reach as soon as possible, as fast as possible, Europe, to connect Europe with Asia. But as a matter of fact, that was a misunderstanding, because those projects or the flows connecting since the 2000, and particularly since the 2010, connecting the Gulf with the Mediterranean and Asia with the Mediterranean were not direct, just instrumental to reach Europe, but they were worth for themselves. They were intended to connect more the Gulf with the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean. And that's it. Or to connect East Asia with. So, as a matter of fact, just to finish, my then point is that for this short reconstruction, we can understand some of the relevant changes in the region, the Mediterranean, that is the major assertiveness, the major active role played today, even in politics, by countries on the eastern shores and the southern shores of the Mediterranean by themselves, and not only as a reaction or as instrumental to European countries. Okay, I would stop here, which is, of course, as usual, too late. And yes.
Well, it's never too late. It's usually too early, huh? All right. Thank you, Professor Trentin. We really are running out of time, but we had a couple of questions. Of course, I have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
But we had some question here. I'm not sure that it is directly related to the topic of our discussion today. The US supplies of shale gas can influence the amount of supplies from the Russian Federation. So can they decrease the relevance of the Mediterranean region in the energy aspect, as shale gas and shale oil are able to replace the analogs from Russia and the Middle East?
Well, just very briefly, what we are witnessing is that a major effort by Europeans and the European Union to diversify their relations, their energy supplies, their energy imports from different sources. If the traditional sources of energy came from Russia and the Middle East, now the supply of energy from North America, the famous shale gas, might be welcomed. And I'm sure that they will be welcomed and used by Europe. But this won't mean a major decline in the sources or originating from the Middle East, and thus passing through again the Mediterranean area or by Russia. One major, and it is not much shale gas that might concern or worry suppliers like Russia or Middle Eastern countries, but instead a major source of concern, like it was in the past, is the increased shift towards energy-saving technologies within European economies and societies. This is a major reasons, and for, I would argue, concern for energy-producing countries. That was the case even in the 70s and the 80s. That was the case, that of course, and now it is accelerating. And now it is accelerating more and more. So the Mediterranean will continue to play much importance as a major source of energy supplies to Europe. It will decline in relative terms, but not that much. The major reason is the absolute decline of energy consumption, of hydrocarbon consumption, due to the major enforcement of energy-saving technologies. Then,
okay, thank you. There is next question. How does Italy feel about the construction of Nord Stream 2? Is that possible to construct another one in the Mediterranean?
Well, I don't have many elements to reply to you.
Well,
to reply to this question. I would say that in Italy there is quite a broad consensus over diversifying more and more our sources of energy as much as possible, and not depending on just a few sources of energy. There is now on the way of I don't know whether this is completed or not, but new pipelines for gas stretching across the Adriatic from the Balkans to the Adriatic Sea, and this is very, very welcome. And the point is the diversification of the sources, And if they pass through the Mediterranean, that would be okay. If they come straight without the fewer intermediaries we have, and that's a general remark, the better it is. And that's the point of Nord Stream.
Well, you never know. I think that Italy is not overly concerned about Nord Stream 2 because it's basically the concern of Northern European countries, and Italy has alternative supplies from Algeria, for example, which more or less places it in a comfortable position, whatever happens with Nord Stream 2.
Yeah, but usually there is quite of a general, that's quite welcome anyway in Italy, as far as I know, because traditionally, with much caution, there is quite of a general consensus on the fact that relationship with Russia must be as much as possible based on cooperation rather than confrontation.
No.
But so if those kind of initiatives might help, well, there is a general trend towards consent on those initiatives. But it's not just a major matter for us. It's maybe we are concerned about the indirect consequences of the cooperation or confrontations between Northern European countries and Russia. That's the point. Well, because the Nord Stream is over there.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I have several questions, but I guess that those questions might be put into one, as a matter of fact. Yeah. I was sort of terrified when I saw in your presentation territorial and national states in the Middle East and North Africa. Can you specify which ones you mean exactly? And I mean national states. Where have you found national states in the Middle East and North Africa?
Now, there are...
well, except Egypt, of course.
Yeah,
I gave you an escape route. Huh?
That's it.
Of course.
That's a thorny issue,
Yeah.
a thorny question. That
Of course it is.
And no, for scholars, but first of all for the very same politics and societies of those countries. With the territorial states, I mean those states presiding over territories and societies where the notion of the nation, that is that political community defining itself or defined as the nation, is not that consolidated, is not that much agreed about by the very same people living there, because there are other kind of allegiance that might prove more important to them. That was the case in particular in countries like Lebanon, like Syria, like Jordan, like Palestine, where there always have been forces arguing for the construction, the presence and the constructions of a Lebanese nation, of a Syrian nation. But at the same time, those forces had to live and compete even with other forces advocating for other kind of allegiances and identities. In other countries like Egypt,
something is wrong with the connection. I wonder whether it is here or it is not here. Well, I guess we lost Professor Trentin. No?
It seems so.
It looks as though we lost him. Okay, all right. So I guess we might as well. I think he has problems with connection at his end, but more or less we concluded our meeting today. So I will thank Professor Trentin via WhatsApp, and I guess that's it. If you have any more questions concerning the topic that was risen today, I can try and answer those questions replacing Professor Trentin, but if not, then I wish everyone a good evening, and we will see you during our next meeting, which we will announce through usual channels. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay. So see you soon. Massi, I already answered all the questions and and said goodbye to everybody. And I told our audience that I will thank you through WhatsApp, but all right, you are with us once again.
Okay, sorry,
So-
sorry, the connection failed.
No, it's not your fault. We all suffer from those connection things. But anyways, I still have some questions, but we will discuss them later on during our next meetings. And I thank everyone for being with us today. And Professor Trentin, our friend and colleague, thank you very much for the usual top level of argument that you presented us, and we will see you during our next meeting.
Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for your patience, and see you next.
See you soon. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.